This kind of outdated, military-style rigidity is exactly what costs this hospital money. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before his entire career collapsed on live television. St. Michael's in San Diego hums with fluorescent lights casting blue shadows across polished linoleum, the sharp bite of antiseptic mixing with coffee from the nurse's station at 2:13 in the afternoon. Laura Bennett moves through the third-floor corridor like water finding the path of least resistance, her hand steady as surgical steel as she checks for lines with a precision that makes younger nurses uncomfortable. Nobody asks her questions. Nobody makes eye contact. She has learned that invisibility is a survival skill, and she wears it like armor under navy scrubs that have been washed 847 times. In her locker, beneath her name tape and a half-empty container of electrolyte powder, sits a pair of combat boots. Leather cracked and faded from desert sun, laces still knotted from the last time anyone tied them who wasn't her. She touches them every morning at 5:19 a.m., her fingers tracing the scuff marks like a rosary. A barely visible tremor runs through her left hand when she's alone, a shake that moves through her palm like electricity looking for ground. When she's near people, her hands become stone. Perfectly still. Perfectly controlled. The tremor is not fear. The tremor is restraint. At 2 p.m., Dr. Whitfield appears at the nurse's station with the presence of someone accustomed to being observed, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, eye scanning her charting with theatrical disdain. Laura does not look up. She has learned that looking up invites conversation, and conversation requires explanations she cannot give. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in glass, and somewhere down the corridor a ventilator wheels its mechanical rhythm past the supply closet. Bennett. His voice carries across the station the way expensive cologne announces arrival before a person walks through a door. Conference room. 5 minutes. Your patient care documentation needs discussion with the attending staff. Laura closes her folder. She does not respond with questions. She does not offer excuses. She simply nods once, a movement so small it could almost be mistaken for a tremor, and stands. Her height surprises people. 5'10" in bare feet. Taller in shoes. She wears sensible Dansko clogs, black, with a grip pattern designed for wet floors and emergency sprints. They make no sound on linoleum. The conference room at St. Michael's holds 12 residents and for attending physicians arranged around a table manufactured to appear collaborative but designed to establish hierarchy. Dr. Whitfield stands at the head, which is the only direction he has ever learned to face. A projector illuminates a screen with Laura's charting from 3 weeks prior, room for 12, post-operative day 2, a patient with abdominal separation who developed stage 3 decubitus ulcers. Her notes run 17 lines. Each one documents wound assessment, dressing changes, pressure relief protocols, photographic documentation of healing progression, and supply costs itemized to the nearest cent. This, Dr. Whitfield says, his pointer tapping the screen, is what outdated medical practice looks like in 2024. Excessive wound protocols. Unnecessary documentation. Inflated supply costs. He pauses. And the real issue, reduced bed turnover. This patient occupied room for 12 for 74 hours instead of the hospital standard of 56. Laura stands at the periphery of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Simply still. The kind of stillness that comes from having once remained motionless for 8 hours in 134-degree heat while maintaining a perimeter that protected 3 junior corpsmen and a 19-year-old Marine with an eviscerated abdomen. Thorough charting is not a luxury, Dr. Whitfield continues, his voice taking on the cadence of someone performing for an audience rather than addressing a person. It's a waste of nursing time that should be allocated to bed turnover efficiency. It's the kind of military-style thinking, rigid, inflexible, obsessed with procedure over profit, that we're trying to move past here at St. Michael's. One of the residents, a woman named Chen with intelligent eyes that actually see things, shifts slightly in her seat. Nobody else moves. Laura's jaw remains level. The only change is that her breathing becomes harder to detect. The documentation suggests, Dr. Whitfield says, turning to face her directly, that you flagged 3 billing discrepancies in your charting notes. 3 billing irregularities that have somehow been approved through standard channels. He smiles. It is the smile of someone holding all the cards and certain of how the hand will play. Those flagged items have since been resolved. No action needed. But perhaps, he turns back to the attending physicians, this illustrates why we need to streamline documentation protocols. Too many flags. Too much bureaucracy. Too much cost. Laura's hands do not tremble. Her breathing does not quicken. Her voice, when she finally speaks, carries no inflection. I was documenting wound assessment observations, Dr. Whitfield. The billing notes appeared in the same field. Noted, he says, but he is not looking at her anymore. He is looking at the residents, establishing his version of events in the minds of younger physicians who will carry it forward like a contagion. Next item. The conference room empties. Nobody speaks to her as they file past. The attending physicians have learned that proximity to controversy is a career liability, and Laura Bennett, thorough, quiet, competent Laura Bennett, has somehow become controversial. At the vending machine on the 3rd floor landing, 2 residents she does not know exchange low voices while the machine hums its mechanical breath. One of them laughs, a sound like ice cracking. Did you catch that? The quiet one, the nurse who keeps all those records. The voice belongs to a resident named Marcus, 3rd year, ambitious in a way that calculates every interaction for advantage. She probably couldn't hack it in the real military. That's why she's here checking tubes instead of doing actual work. His companion laughs. The sound echoes down the corridor like a prediction. Laura walks past them without changing pace. Not because she doesn't hear. Not because the words don't register. But because she has learned that the only response to disrespect is excellence, and she has 3 hours left of her shift, and there is a patient in room 347 who has been blind since an IED detonated in Marja 3 years ago, and that patient's name on her assignment sheet made her hands grip the edge of the nurse's station for exactly 4 seconds. Retired Marine Sergeant James Chen. She checks the time, 2:41 p.m. She will enter room 347 in approximately 19 minutes, after completing her med pass on the 2nd floor. She will do this the way she has done every difficult thing in her life, with perfect composure and hands that do not shake. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead as she climbs the stairwell, her footsteps moving through silence that feels less like peace and more like the moment before detonation. She has been called many things. Rigid. Inflexible. Outdated. Military. She has never been called anything close to the truth, and she understands now, at 2:51 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in San Diego, that the truth is about to become very complicated. Room 347 has a window facing the parking lot where rain has begun to fall in scattered drops that sound like small caliber rounds on the windows. James Chen sits in a reclining chair, his eyes obscured by scarring that runs from temple to jawline, the kind of scarring that comes from blast force and burns and survival against odds that most people cannot calculate. His hands rest on the arms of the chair with the same controlled stillness that Laura recognizes instantly, because it is the stillness of someone who has learned to trust other senses when vision fails. He turns slightly as she enters. Not toward her, but toward the sound of her shoes on linoleum, and Laura understands immediately that he hears the difference in her step compared to the day shift nurses. Lighter. Controlled. Military precise. Sergeant Chen, she says, and her voice carries no deference, no forced warmth, no performance. It carries only information. I'm Laura Bennett. I'm your nurse today. I need to check your dressing. He nods. A single movement. Recognition passing between them like a frequency that only certain people can hear. You were in, he says. Not a question. Laura does not answer immediately. She pulls on nitrile gloves with a snapping sound that echoes slightly in the quiet room. Her hands, as always, are perfectly steady. Let me see what we're working with here, Sergeant. He does not push the question. He understands that answers will come on their own time, the way everything worth understanding eventually surfaces. she unwraps the dressing on his left arm, revealing burn scars that tell a story of rapid thermal injury and field triage that someone managed with materials that probably should not have worked but did. The wound is healing clean. No signs of infection. The color progression indicates granulation tissue that is responding to protocol. This is good, she says, meaning the wound, but also meaning something larger that neither of them acknowledges out loud. I'm going to change this twice daily. You're going to get better. He turns his head toward her voice. His blind eyes, pale blue beneath the scarring, move in the direction of sound the way a satellite tracks a signal. You have a son, James Chen says quietly. Laura's hands pause for exactly one heartbeat. 1. Then they resume moving with the smooth precision of someone who has made this motion 10,000 times. She wraps the new dressing around his arm with pressure that is firm enough to hold but gentle enough to not aggravate underlying tissue. I did, she says. Present tense has become past tense somewhere in the last 3 years, and she does not correct the statement, because some truths are too large for hospital rooms and fluorescent light. He was in my unit, James Chen says. Second squad. Young kid, scared but good. The kind of scared that makes you careful instead of reckless. Laura's breathing becomes something she has to remember to do consciously. In. Out. The way she was trained, the way she has practiced 10,000 times in dark rooms where nobody was watching. I remember, she says, and her voice has dropped into a register that sounds like someone else entirely, like a different version of herself that has not worn this uniform in a very long time. I remember all of them. Outside, rain hammers the window like it is trying to break through, and in the hallway beyond the closed door, the fluorescent lights buzz their mechanical rhythm, oblivious to the fact that everything has just changed in a room that appears, from any distance, to be ordinary. The hallway outside room 347 smelled like antiseptic and rain-soaked concrete bleeding in from the loading dock. Laura stepped into it with measured movements, and that's when Dr. Whitfield materialized from the stairwell, a security guard named Martinez following 2 steps behind like a shadow that had learned to walk upright. Bennett. Whitfield's voice carried the particular venom of a man accustomed to instant obedience. We need to clarify something. Laura turned. Her face was a closed door. Her hands remained at her sides, palms forward, a gesture that looked casual but was, in fact, the physical posture of someone demonstrating they held no weapons, a habit older than her nursing license. One more procedural deviation, Whitfield continued, stepping closer. One more supply requisition I didn't personally approve. One more instance of you deciding hospital protocol doesn't apply to you. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like sediment in water. And Martinez here will escort you from this building. Permanently. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Doctor, Laura said. Her voice was level as glass, flat in a way that suggested she had practiced this, the art of delivering compliance while revealing nothing underneath it. Whitfield's eyes drifted past her shoulder, down the hallway toward the staff lockers near the break room. I know about the boots, he said quietly. The combat boots in your locker. The ones you think nobody notices. His smile was the kind that predators wore when they'd caught the scent of blood in water. Playing dress-up doesn't make you something you're not, Nurse Bennett. It just makes you delusional. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds, though it felt longer, the way a held breath always does. Understood, Laura said. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply turned and walked back into room 347, and Whitfield watched her go with the expression of a man who believed he had just established dominance. He had not. He had simply revealed that he was the kind of adversary who conducted surveillance on personal effects, which told Laura everything she needed to know about how far he was willing to escalate. She filed that information away with the precision of someone trained to catalog tactical intelligence. Sergeant Chen was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady, the heart monitor maintaining its mechanical rhythm. Laura checked his foresight, adjusted the drip rate, and documented everything in his chart with a meticulous handwriting that had apparently become a liability in Dr. Whitfield's version of healthcare. Then she found the supply closet, a narrow space wedged between the medication dispensary and the linen carts, and locked herself inside. 30 seconds. That's all she allowed. Her hands gripped the edge of a metal shelf, and they trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer concentrated effort of restraint, the way a dam trembles under pressure it has been engineered to withstand. Her breathing came in controlled sequences, 4 counts in, hold for 4, 6 counts out. A technique that had kept her alive in Marja when IEDs detonated close enough to rearrange her organs, close enough that she'd had to manually decompress her own chest cavity before the dust settled. This was nothing compared to that. This was a man in a $5,000 suit making threats about supply requisitions. This was institutional power pretending to be dangerous. But Whitfield had mentioned the boots. He had been in her locker. He knew what she kept in the bottom, under her spare scrubs and compression socks, the pair of tan combat boots, salt-stained from helm and province sweat, the leather creased in patterns that matched the topography of her own feet. The boots had been the only thing she'd kept. Everything else, the dress uniforms, the medals, the commendation letters, the photographs of her unit standing in front of a Black Hawk with the Hindu Kush mountains burning behind them, everything else had been destroyed per the order she'd received at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, 31 months ago. The boots she had kept because you could explain boots. A veteran's boot was not unusual. A veteran's boot was predictable. A veteran's boot did not raise the kinds of questions that got asked in federal buildings by people with badges and the kind of authority that made lawyers nervous. But Whitfield had been in her locker. He knew. Or he suspected. Or he was simply cruel enough to mention something she kept hidden, which was its own form of power, the power to make someone understand that their private things were not actually private, that surveillance had become casually intimate in ways that transcended the electronic. Laura emerged from the supply closet 3 minutes later, her breathing restored to baseline, her hand steady. She had work to do. Patients to monitor. A man in room 347 who needed someone to sit with him during the hollow hours between midnight and dawn, and she would be that person because it was her job and because Sergeant James Chen, who had commanded her son during his final deployment, deserved better than a man who studied supply costs and ignored the way a patient's eyes reflected the absence of light. The night shift stretched long and quiet. Laura moved through St. Michael's like a ghost with a stethoscope, checking vital signs, adjusting medications, documenting observations with the thoroughness that Whitfield had publicly scorned. At 2 a.m., she found herself pulling a chair into room 347, settling beside Sergeant Chen's bed with the kind of stillness that suggested she had nowhere else to be, that this particular moment, this particular patient, was the only thing that mattered. Chen's blind eyes were fixed on the ceiling, his scarred face catching the blue-white glow of the heart monitor. He'd been burned when an IED detonated near his Humvee, burns that had taken his sight but not his breathing, and the surgeons at Landstuhl had done what surgeons do, they kept him alive, which was sometimes a mercy and sometimes wasn't. "You don't talk much, Nurse Bennett," Chen said quietly, as if he'd been aware of her presence all along. "Most of them chatter. Fill the silence with words because quiet bothers them. You let it sit." Laura checked his foresight, her movements precise and economical. She didn't respond immediately. In her experience, silence was a more honest language than speech. "Had a medic once," Chen continued, his voice rough as gravel, "who moved like you. Quiet. Efficient. She could stabilize a casualty with her eyes closed, literally, she'd done it in the dark after a compound got hit." He paused. "Saved my entire squad in Marja when an IED turned our Humvee into scrap metal and burning gasoline. Everyone said she was a ghost. Said she wasn't real. Rumors, you know how it goes in the military." Laura's hand froze on the four-pole. "Your son serve?" Chen asked, turning his scarred face in the direction of her voice with the kind of accuracy that only came from months of relearning the world without his eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like insects trapped in glass, like electricity learning to sing. "Yes," Laura said finally. "Marines." "What unit?" 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. 4th Deployment. Chen's hand found the bed rail. he gripped it with the strength of someone who still had muscle memory for holding on. Who was his commanding officer? Laura was quiet for a long moment. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, heart monitor, oxygen saturation, blood pressure cuff cycling on a 30-minute interval. Numbers translating biology into data, vitals into graphs, a human being into a series of values that could be written down and filed away. Sergeant James Chen, she said. He wrote me a letter after David didn't come home. The silence in the room changed texture. It became denser, heavier, the kind of quiet that preceded earthquakes or confessions. Phantom, Chen whispered. Your call sign. I heard it once. Right before he stopped. His scarred face turned away. Right before everything changed. Before the extraction. Before they told us to forget we'd ever known anyone by that name. Laura stood. Her composure remained absolute, her face a clean slate, her movements economical. You need rest, Sergeant, she said, and there was something in her voice now, something underneath the professional flatten, that suggested she had not just closed a door but had barricaded it and thrown away the key. But she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she checked his monitors twice, adjusted his blanket with a care that bordered on reverence, ensured his call button was within reach, and stood for precisely 6 seconds at the foot of his bed looking at a man whose blindness meant he could never see who she was, only hear it in the way she moved, in the muscle memory of her hands, in the presence of someone who had already survived the kind of things that killed most people. At 3:06 a.m., Laura sat in an empty diner 6 blocks from St. Michael's, the kind of place that never closed and therefore belonged to no one, that existed in perpetuity as a way station between one life and another. Her coffee had gone cold. The cup sat between her hands like an accusation. Outside, rain hammered the windows with a kind of insistence that suggested it was trying to break through, to reach her, to remind her that there were still forces in the world she could not control. She stared at her reflection in the black glass, a woman of 47, grey threading through her dark hair, a face carved from decisions that had been made for her and decisions she had made herself, and they had become so intertwined that she could no longer distinguish between the two. Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. For Silver Stars. Navy Cross. Commendations for valor that would have meant something in a different life, in a timeline where a contractor's fraud scheme hadn't required scapegoats, where her unit hadn't become politically inconvenient, where she hadn't been ordered to disappear or face prosecution for violations that had been fabricated by men in offices far from any battlefield. Her son's commander was in room 347. And she wondered, as she had wondered 10,000 times since receiving the letter saying David would not be coming home, whether he would understand that she might have to walk away, that sometimes surviving meant accepting erasure, that the alternative to disappearing was something worse. The phones in Dr. Whitfield's office started ringing at 5:11 a.m., before the hospital corridors had even begun to fill with the first shift. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a piece that had cost more than most nurses earned in a year, and made 3 calls with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of institutional destruction. The first call went to board chairman Douglas Hearn at his home in La Jolla. Whitfield knew Hearn would be awake. Men like Hearn didn't sleep past 5. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, cautious and aware. Douglas, it's Richard Whitfield. We have a liability issue. Tell me. Hearn's voice was sharp, all business. One of my nurses, Bennett, Laura Bennett, her documentation patterns are becoming problematic. She's second-guessing physician orders, flagging things that don't need flagging, inflating costs with unnecessary procedures. I'm concerned she may be experiencing some kind of psychological break. I need your support for immediate termination. Silence. Then, you have it. You've brought me 3 cardiac referrals this quarter alone. Whatever you need. The line went dead. Whitfield's fingers moved to the second number without pause. Patricia Voss at Seaside Community Clinic answered on the 4th ring, her voice wary the way administrators' voices always were when Whitfield called. Ms. Voss, I'm doing a credential verification on a potential hire. Laura Bennett. Can you confirm her employment history with you? He heard papers shuffling. Then, I have no record of a Laura Bennett employed here. In any capacity. In any period. You're certain? Completely certain. The second line went dead. Whitfield smiled. Laura Bennett didn't exist. A seaside community clinic because Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Reese had been erased from every official record the day the merger operation went sideways, redacted, classified, buried so deep that the woman sitting in St. Michael's pulling 12-hour shifts was less real on paper than a ghost. Someone had constructed Laura Bennett from fragments and false documentation, and that someone had been sloppy enough to list a clinic that would corroborate the fabrication. But Whitfield had just cut that thread. The third call took longer to place. He waited for Risk Management Director Thomas Kuhn to arrive at his office, 7:22 a.m., and dialed with the careful tone of a man reporting a concern. "Thomas, I need to file a formal complaint. I've noticed unusual patterns in Nurse Bennett's supply usage, particularly in our trauma and critical care inventory. Her interest in our billing procedures strikes me as beyond appropriate scope. I'm wondering if she might be diverting controlled substances. I'd like to request an immediate audit of her access and usage logs." Whitfield could hear Kuhn swallow. Substance diversion was the nightmare scenario for hospital administration. One nurse caught stealing fentanyl and the DEA could shut down the entire operation, revoke licenses, demand documentation from 5 years back. "I'll start the audit today," Kuhn said. "Where exactly is your concern centered?" "Pain management supplies. Sedatives. Anything high value. And Thomas, keep this quiet. If it's unfounded, we don't need to damage the staff morale. But if it's real, we need to know fast." The line went dead. By 8:15 a.m., the institutional machinery had begun its work. By 8:48 a.m., Laura Bennett was sitting in HR Director Kenneth Park's office on the 3rd floor, her hands folded in her lap, her face a study in controlled composure that gave away nothing, no anger, no fear, no surprise. Just the flat watchful expression of someone who had learned long ago that emotion was a liability. "Nurse Bennett, we've received concerns about your credential verification." Park was reading from a form, his eyes carefully avoiding hers. "We've also initiated an audit of your supply management access due to some discrepancies that have come to our attention. Effective immediately, you're being placed on administrative leave pending investigation." "Understood," Laura said. 4 words. Steady. Professional. "You complete your shift today, then we'll need you to turn in your badge and credentials. There will be a meeting with risk management within 48 hours. You may bring representation if you choose." She nodded once. Not a gesture of agreement. A gesture of acknowledgement. The distinction was subtle, but it was there. She stood, and the chair didn't scrape, her movements were precise, economical, the movements of someone who had learned to move through hostile spaces without making noise. "Your shift ends at 4 p.m., Park said as she reached the door. "Please ensure all charting is complete before you leave." She didn't respond. She simply opened the door and walked back toward the nursing station, where 3 nurses immediately stopped talking and looked away. By noon, the entire floor would know that Laura Bennett was on administrative leave, that there were questions about her credentials, that risk management had opened an audit. By 2 p.m., the story would have evolved. She'd probably been stealing drugs, probably had a fake license, probably wasn't even a real nurse. The institutional narrative was already building itself, each person adding their own layer, each rumor making the next one more plausible. In room 347, Sergeant James Chen was asleep in the afternoon light, his blind eyes moving beneath closed lids, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Laura stopped at the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to read the monitors, long enough to see what Whitfield had missed in his haste to dismiss her concerns. Blood pressure 142/88, elevated but not alarming. Heart rate 103, slightly high. But the waveform on the cardiac monitor showed irregularity, not arrhythmia exactly, but something subtle, something that suggested pressure building around the heart, fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac. Cardiac tamponade in its early stages. Give it 8 hours without intervention, maybe 12, and Sergeant Chen's heart would stop being able to pump. The pressure would build until the ventricles could no longer expand, and then there would be nothing left to do but wait for the code that would come when his blood pressure dropped to nothing. Dr. Whitfield had ordered observation only. Routine observation. No echocardiogram. No cardiac imaging. Just watch and wait. Laura stood in the doorway and calculated the hours remaining with the precision of someone who had run through this math before, in field hospitals in Helmand Province, in transport helicopters, in triage tents when supplies ran short and decisions became equations: time, available resources, probability of survival. The door to room 347 opened behind her, and she turned. Dr. Whitfield stood there with his tablet, his expression professionally neutral, his eyes moving past her as if she were part of the doorframe. "Your shift ends at 4, he said. Dr. Hayes is taking over Chen's care this evening. I want to make it clear that you are not to approach this patient after your shift ends. Not for any reason. That's an explicit order." It wasn't a request. It was a command. "Understood," Laura said. "And Bennett, I'd suggest you get a lawyer. The audit is going to find some interesting things." She didn't answer. She simply stepped aside to let him pass, and his shoes clicked against the tile floor as he moved down the hallway, already composing his next email, already 3 steps ahead in the destruction he was carefully constructing. By 3:45 p.m., Laura's replacement, a young nurse named Michelle with 3 years of experience and no combat medical training, was preparing to take over Sergeant Chen's care. Laura stood at the nursing station and documented her shift notes with meticulous precision: vital sign trends, medication administration, the irregularities in Chen's cardiac rhythm, her clinical assessment, her recommendation for echocardiography. She knew the documentation wouldn't matter. She knew that by morning, someone would redact it, misfile it, claim it was incomplete. But she documented anyway, because documentation was the only weapon she had left, the only thing that told the truth after everyone else had been paid to lie. At 4:02 p.m., she turned in her badge to the security guard at the lobby desk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Whitfield was making another phone call, telling another board member about the nurse who couldn't be trusted, who had falsified credentials, whose judgment was compromised. The network was already working: 6 years of favor trading, years of directing profitable cases to board members who had given Whitfield access to their institutions in return. He had built something resilient, something that could survive one disgraced nurse, something that would chew her up and spit her out and move on to the next profitable quarter. The rain started falling as Laura walked to her car, and she didn't hurry. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, watching the hospital's front entrance, watching the rain hammer the parking lot like applause for something she couldn't celebrate. In room 347, Sergeant James Chen was beginning his 8th hour, and his heart was beginning to fail, and somewhere in the bureaucratic labyrinth she'd just walked away from, 2 people who had never met were about to discover that the woman they'd just destroyed might be the only person in the hospital who could save him. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as Laura stood 3 doors down, checking vitals on a post-op patient whose chart she'd promised herself not to obsess over. Room 347. The cardiac monitor there was supposed to be monitored by someone else now, someone whose name she would not think about. She was legally banned from approaching Sergeant Chen's bedside, her suspension paperwork already signed by Director Park and countersigned by Whitfield's expensive pen. Off the case. Off the floor. Effective immediately after shift completion. She had 4 hours remaining in the hospital, 4 hours to walk the corridors as a ghost, untouched and untouching, her hands kept to herself while a blind Marine's heart rhythms changed on monitors she could no longer legally interpret. The alarm screamed at 2:07 p.m. Not a warning chime. Full code alert. The electrocardiogram machine shrieking its flatline howl through the hospital's nervous system. Laura's body moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory that 18 years of civilian nursing could not erase. She was 3 doors down. She was moving. Dr. Hay fumbled past her in the corridor, his tablet dropping, his voice high: "Code blue, room 347, where's the crash cart?" He reached the room before her, his hands already shaking as he assessed Sergeant Chen's collapsed form. The monitor showed ventricular fibrillation, Chen's heart no longer beating but seizing, a useless electrical storm trapped in muscle tissue. Death in real time. Laura stepped into the room and everything else stopped existing. Tamponade. She said it flat, a statement not a question. Her eyes read Chen's presentation in 3 seconds, the distended neck veins, the muffled heart sounds, the sudden collapse during a routine exam. Not a simple cardiac arrest. Something catastrophic compressing his heart from outside. We need a thoracotomy now. He's got maybe 3 minutes. Dr. Hay stared at her. We need to wait for cardiothoracic surgery, they're 10 minutes out. He'll be dead in 2. Laura was already moving to the supply station, her hand steady as surgical steel. She pulled on sterile gloves with one smooth motion, her scrubs already being soaked by hospital staff who had stopped thinking and started responding to her voice like soldiers following orders in a phi base. A nurse named Martinez was pulling the crash cart. Another, Okoye, was already understanding what came next, a procedure she'd read about in textbooks but never expected to witness performed by someone in scrubs rather than a surgeon in a private OR. Thoracotomy tray, full set, move. Laura's voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a question. It was a command that moved through the room like electricity. The antiseptic smell of surgical prep filled the air as she swabbed Chen's left anterior chest. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who had done this on stretchers in Marja while mortars fell and blood pooled faster than any foot could replace it. 200 combat saves. The number lived in her muscles the way fear lived in other people's faces. She located the 5th intercostal space with her fingertips, anatomical landmarks that had never left her even when she pretended to be only a nurse. Local anesthetic, 1% lidocaine, push it now. The needle went in. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing did not accelerate. Pain was information. Blood was information. The body was a machine with known failure points and she had spent half her life learning every one. The scalpel came from the tray and Laura made the incision, long, decisive, opening the left chest wall with the confidence of someone who had performed this procedure under fire. Muscle, fascia, ribs. The internal mammary artery was visible, pulsing blood that told her everything. She was through the pleura in seconds, her fingers following the path her muscle memory had carved into her nervous system. Blood poured from around Chen's heart, dark and venous. Tamponade. The pericardium was full, the sac surrounding his heart compressing it like a fist squeezing a beating bird. Pericardial drain, she said. 10 blade on the pericardium, open it now, decompress the pressure. Her left hand was already inside Chen's chest cavity, 2 fingers positioned at his heart. Direct cardiac massage. Her right index and middle finger began the rhythm, steady, precise, compressing his left ventricle against his sternum with the pressure of someone who had learned this motion on a corpse in Marja and perfected it on the living. Push 1 mg epi 4, another dose in 3 minutes, Martinez I need suction here, there's too much blood, I can't see the room had transformed into a combat trauma response. Okoye was managing the fall line, medications flowing. A respiratory therapist was at Chen's head with the endotracheal tube already placed. Dr. Hay stood against the wall, his hands useless, his certification suddenly worthless in the presence of someone operating on pure muscle memory and training that had never required his permission. Laura's fingers worked Chen's heart with the steady rhythm of a metronome, 70 compressions per minute, her hand never faltering, her breath controlled. The monitor began to change. Irregular electrical activity appeared, disorganized patterns that meant the heart was beginning to respond, to remember how to beat. Come on, she said to Chen, to his blind eyes that couldn't see her, to the parts of him that lived in memory and combat and the moment they had both pretended was forgotten. Come on, Sergeant. You've got 18 people who walked because of you. Your daughter's in the waiting room. You don't get to quit. The monitor jumped. A single spike. Then another. The seizing stopped. The electrical chaos resolved into organized rhythm, sinus tachycardia, fast but organized, the heart remembering how to work. Chen's oxygen saturation began climbing, 42. 51, 63. 78, 88. Stable. His skin color improved from cyanotic gray to something approaching life. Laura kept her hand on his heart for 30 more seconds, feeling it beat against her palm, the physical proof of a human being returning from the edge. "We've got sinus rhythm," someone said. A nurse. Laura no longer knew which one. Her entire world had narrowed to the man on the bed and the machine underneath her fingers and the moment she should release control but didn't, not yet, not until she was absolutely certain he would keep breathing on his own. Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway. His face changed in the space of 3 seconds. Recognition. Shock. Rage. His eyes moved from Laura's blood-soaked form to the open chest cavity to the monitors showing stable rhythm, and whatever he saw in that moment told him something he could not unknow and could not control. His jaw tightened. His hands closed into fists. "Get her away from that patient," he said, his voice cold. "Now." Laura didn't move her hand. The rhythm stayed stable. Chen's blood pressure was recovering, climbing back toward something compatible with consciousness. She withdrew her fingers with deliberate slowness, each motion careful, and stepped back from the bed as Whitfield's face darkened further. "Get her out of this hospital," he said to Dr. Hay. "Find security. Now." 2 hours later, Laura sat in Director Park's office with her hands folded in her lap. The worn combat boots she had retrieved from her locker sat on the floor beside her chair. Whitfield stood by the window, his reflection fractured in the glass, his phone already in his other hand. Park's expression was sympathetic and utterly inevitable, the expression of someone who had already received 17 phone calls explaining what had happened and from what legal angle the hospital was now exposed. "Nurse Bennett," Park began, "what you performed in that room was a thoracotomy. That procedure is explicitly restricted to cardiothoracic surgeons and emergency physicians with specific training and credentialing. A registered nurse performing that procedure, regardless of the outcome, is a direct violation of scope of practice. I'm suspending you effective immediately, pending a board review that will likely result in termination and a report to the state nursing board that may impact your license." Laura said nothing. Her composure was perfect. Not a muscle in her face moved. Whitfield turned from the window. She knew it was prohibited. She was explicitly warned this morning about procedural deviations. She disobeyed a direct instruction from the chief of medicine and acted outside her authority in front of multiple witnesses. That's not a medical judgment, that's insubordination. "We'll notify the board tomorrow," Park continued, her tone final. "You can collect your personal belongings under security supervision. You are not to return to any patient care areas without written authorization from this office. Is that clear?" Laura nodded once, her jaw set, and stood to leave. As she turned toward the door, Whitfield made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, his voice audible through the thin walls. The first to Patricia Cross, who sat on the hospital board. "Yes, we had to remove her immediately. Completely unauthorized procedure. Yes, I understand it saved the patient's life, but that's exactly the point. This is exactly how these people operate. They think they're above the rules because once they get one save, people just let them do whatever they want." The second to someone at an insurance company. "Liability nightmare. Yes, I documented everything. She was explicitly warned. No, I don't think we can contain this depending on who talks to the media." The third to himself, barely a whisper, should have fired her on day 2. Martinez, the security guard, walked Laura to her locker. His expression was uncomfortable, his job and his principles clearly at war with each other. She changed into her personal clothes, pulled on a rain jacket, and held the combat boots in both hands like someone holding something that might break. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, the sound of the hospital continuing in the corridors, codes being called, lives being measured in milliliters and minutes, the whole machine grinding forward without her in it. "For what it's worth," Martinez said quietly as they walked toward the exit, "that was the best thing I've ever seen anyone do in this hospital. What you did in there." Laura didn't respond. She held the boots and walked toward the lobby doors where rain hammered the parking lot like applause for something nobody would admit to celebrating. Behind her, in room 347, Sergeant James Chen was being prepared for transfer to the cardiac ICU, his heart beating steadily, his blind eyes eventually opening to find his daughter standing beside his bed instead of the nurse who had cracked his chest open and given him back his life. And in the hospital's administrative corridors, the gears were already turning, the calls already being made, the machinery beginning its work to erase what had just happened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting in the morning news cycle, 17 hours away, when everything would change in the 30 seconds it took for a single television broadcast to reach the hospital's lobby screen. The morning news broadcast flickered on the lobby television at 7:14 a.m., and the anchor's voice cut through the murmur of pre-shift chatter with the precision of a scalpel. Military investigators have located a Marine medic wanted for commendation, not prosecution. The charges filed against her in 2019 were fabricated to protect a Department of Defense contractor under federal indictment for billing fraud exceeding $47 million. The Pentagon has been searching for this woman for 4 years. Her name is Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Bennett. Her call sign was Phantom. The photograph filled the screen, younger, in desert camouflage, eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen what civilians pray they never see. Laura stopped walking. Her hands went still. The security guard at the desk, Martinez, a retired Army colonel with steel-gray hair and a jaw like a clamping vice, turned to stare at the screen. Then he turned to stare at Laura. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. The mask held. But the photograph was already burning into the minds of every staff member in the lobby, the same face, the same hands holding those worn combat boots in her left grip, the same posture that had been standing motionless in scrubs beside Sergeant Chen's hospital bed for the last 72 hours. Phantom. Sergeant Chen's voice rang from his wheelchair by the nurse's station, suddenly clear, suddenly sharp, suddenly carrying the authority of a Marine who'd just recognized his savior. His blind eyes turned toward the sound of Laura's breathing, across the lobby, 40 feet away. Phantom. There she is. I knew it. I knew it was you the moment you walked into my room. His daughter gripped the wheelchair handles, her mouth opening, closing, understanding dawning across her face like a sunrise over hostile territory. The lobby went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric prayer. Every eye turned. Every phone came up. Every camera in the room swung like weapons toward the woman in bloodstained scrubs standing alone by the elevators, holding a pair of boots that suddenly meant everything. Martinez stood up from his desk. His voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried across the silence like a command across a radio, Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. The elevator doors opened. A 2-star general stepped out holding a manila folder so thick it could have stopped shrapnel. His uniform was pressed sharp enough to cut glass, his shoulders carrying the weight of command the way only men who'd ordered people into impossible situations could carry it. His aide followed 3 steps behind, also in dress uniform, also carrying documentation. The general's eyes found Laura across the lobby in approximately 1 second. He read her face the way a sniper reads wind patterns, calculation, assessment, confirmation. He walked toward her with the terrifying fluid precision of an apex predator approaching its own. The crowd parted without being asked. Muscle memory. Respect. Fear. All 3. The general stopped 3 feet from her, extended the folder. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Bennett. Your service record. 18 years, 2 months. The Pentagon's been waiting a long time to give you this back. The folder opened. For silver stars. Each one mounted on its own line. Each one representing an operation, a save, a moment where the line between life and death had bent because she was there. Then the last citation. A Navy Cross. The highest non-congressional decoration for valor. The general's aide stepped forward with a camera crew from the San Diego NBC affiliate. They'd come expecting a human interest story about a blind veteran recovering from cardiac arrest. They were getting something far larger. Sergeant Chen's voice cut through the moment. His blind eyes turned toward the assembled crowd, but his words directed at Laura, at the general, at the cameras rolling. She took shrapnel meant for my entire squad, including her own son. Carried him 2 miles with a punctured lung before she'd let the medics touch her. That was in March 2018. We were pinned in a compound with 3 minutes of ammunition left. She was our senior enlisted medical officer. She was 28 years old. She saved 17 people that day. 17. And then the government told her to disappear or face charges she never committed. And she did it. She disappeared. To protect us. His daughter's hand covered her mouth. She was crying. Half the nursing staff was crying. The cameras captured every second in high definition, raw, unedited, utterly authentic. General Holland turned to face Dr. Whitfield, who had materialized in the lobby doorway like a ghost watching his own funeral. The general's voice carried with the precision of someone who'd given orders in active combat zones. Dr. Marcus Whitfield. You are the attending physician assigned to Sergeant Chen's care. Whitfield's face had gone grey, the color of a man watching the walls close in. Yes, I was the supervising. You suspended Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett yesterday for performing emergency cardiac massage during a code event. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact with teeth. She performed that procedure as a direct response to a patient's life-threatening condition. According to her combat service record, she has performed open-chest cardiac massage 247 times in field conditions. Her success rate in those situations was 87%. Your hospital's emergency medicine success rate with the same procedure is 34%. You suspended her for being significantly more competent than your protocols allow. The aide handed the general a second document. Whitfield's hands began to tremble. Furthermore, we have been provided documentation by hospital administration suggesting you flagged her patient care charts for review because she identified billing irregularities in your pre-authorization patterns. Is that accurate, Doctor? Whitfield's mouth opened. Nothing emerged. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, there are protocols, hospital policies. You called her employment references to sabotage her professional standing, the general continued, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You threatened her with security escort and termination. You interfered with her ability to provide necessary care to a Marine under your direct supervision. Director Park appeared from his office, summoned by some invisible signal. Board Chairman Hearn emerged from the executive corridor, his face bone-white. Martinez had already stepped around the security desk, moving toward Whitfield with the grim purpose of a man about to enforce an order. The general extended his hand to Park. General James Holland, Deputy Commander, Joint Special Operations Command. As of this moment, Dr. Whitfield is relieved of all patient care duties at this facility. I am recommending his medical license be reviewed by the California Medical Board for interference with emergency care and retaliation against a federal witness. The Department of Defense will be forwarding documentation of his billing irregularities to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of California. The cameras rolled. Every angle. Every moment. Whitfield's face went from grey to red, a sunset of shame spreading across his skin. You can't, I have connections, colleagues on the board, the administration will. Hearn stepped forward, his voice cutting like a scalpel. Dr. Whitfield, you're terminated. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Martinez moved. Whitfield moved backward, his hands up, his voice rising. You don't understand what this woman has done. How she violated hospital protocol, how she saved your patient's life, the general said quietly. That is the only protocol that matters. The cameras captured it all. Whitfield being escorted toward the exit by the same security guard who'd threatened to accompany Laura out the day before. The complete reversal. The perfect irony. The moment when power shifted like a tectonic plate, and everyone in the lobby felt the earth move beneath their feet. Dr. Hayes whispered to Dr. Okoye, "Oh my God, we called her a fake." Okoye's hands covered her face. The lobby doors hissed open. Whitfield was guided toward the parking garage. The cameras followed for exactly 17 seconds before his silhouette disappeared into shadow. Then every lens swung back to Laura, standing in her blood-stained scrubs, still holding the worn combat boots, finally able to breathe in her own skin. The general extended his hand. His grip was firm, his eye contact absolute. "Master Chief, your country owes you more than an apology. We owe you your life back." She took his hand. Her grip matched his, a Marine's grip, the kind that had held dying soldiers together, that had compressed chests and tied tourniquets and refused to let go when the world demanded it. Sergeant Chen wheeled himself closer, his daughter helping position him. "Phantom," he said quietly. "David talked about you every damn day. He was proud his mom was the toughest Marine in the whole damn Corps." Laura's other hand found his shoulder, grounding herself in the moment, in the connection, in the knowledge that her son's commander, this man who'd survived because of her, had just given her back her name. Director Park approached cautiously, his posture curved into the shape of genuine remorse. "Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett, we would like to offer you reinstatement with full back pay, a formal apology, and, if you're willing, a position training our emergency response teams." Laura looked at Sergeant Chen, at the assembled staff, at the cameras still recording. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of command it had always carried, just finally allowed to surface. "I'll think about it. Right now, I need to check on my patient. He just had a thoracotomy, and someone needs to monitor his recovery properly." She walked toward the elevators, boots in one hand, the other giving Chen's wheelchair a gentle push. The crowd parted without being asked. As the doors opened, she turned back one final time. Her voice carried across the lobby with the quiet certainty of someone who'd spent 18 years knowing exactly who she was. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The doors closed on her face, finally breathing in her own skin, finally home. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.